Hi and welcome back to McClatchy Maths. My name is Natalie McClatchy and today I'm taking you through our first video on how to write a problem solving and modelling task for our students in Queensland. This is the Formulate part of the assignment, and in this particular video we are going to find out what the key parts of the assignment are and look at some examples of some students' work as well as some QCAA exemplars to explain the point. So let's get started. So let's have a quick overview of the key parts that I'll be touching on in today's video. Firstly, we're going to look at your introductory paragraph. How do we write that? What goes in the paragraph? How long should it be? We're going to talk about how to define your variables and other key terms for your assignment and look at how to write a clear and concise procedure. We'll move on then to talk about the considerations that you need to write about in your assignment, how to talk about the use of technology and observations and assumptions. And we'll have a lot more detail on observations and assumptions in videos 2 and 3 in this series. So if that's what you're mainly interested in, skip to the next video. Okay, so let's talk about that introductory paragraph. Firstly, you need to state briefly what your report is about. So someone should actually be able to read your introduction paragraph and understand what's on your task sheet because you've summarized that really succinctly and briefly into one single paragraph. It should really explain everything you're going to cover. You should be writing it in the future tense because you haven't started writing the report yet. So it'll have language like this report will investigate, this report will research, and so on. It should be written in the third person. That means we don't use the word I, we don't use the word me, we don't use the word we don't use the word you or your. So we're writing it as though we're actually separate from the assignment itself. So rather than saying my report will do this, we would say this report will do this. We should state the context of the assignment. I've already mentioned this, but it's really important we understand that we should be able to read that paragraph and know precisely what the assignment is about. So for example, if you're writing an assignment that explores a budget to go on a holiday, you need to state that in the opening paragraph. You should have key information in there about where the holiday is going to be to, how many people are going to be traveling, if there's any budget constraints. So here's an example here on my screen. It's not a perfect introduction, but it's one from a student's report in the past. It's looking at bivariate data comparing foot length and body height. And you notice that it's succinct. It doesn't go on and on and on. There's only a couple of sentences, and that's all you really need in that introduction paragraph. It's definitely written in the third person, so we don't see the words I, me, you, we in that paragraph at all. It's written, it sounds very professional when it's written that way. And you'll notice it's also written in the future tense. The aim of this report is to observe the relationships. Discovering this will help. So it's that kind of language that needs to be consistent in the opening part of your report, and that will help contribute as well to your communication grade. You can also read this independently of the task sheet. If you read that yourself and pause and have a read of it, you'll understand straight away that we're comparing relationships between two different types, or actually 3 or 4 different types of bone lengths and someone's body height, and then deciding if we can make predictions. And it also relates back to that context that's in the assignment about how forensic anthropologists use bone measurements to make predictions. So it's a fairly decent introduction. Here's another example, which is the opposite end of the spectrum. It's not a great introduction at all. You'll notice it starts with a very informal tone saying, hello, my name is Alastair Jones. And so that is not the kind of tone we want to set. We want to sound very professional, and that's why we take ourselves out of the picture and write in the third person. And you'll notice this is written in the first person. The use of the word I will do this, I will do that is all the way through this opening paragraph. It is written in future tense, so that's one thing it has going for it, but unfortunately the rest of it just sounds very conversational, and we don't want it to sound too conversational. We want it to sound professional. You'll also notice that there's some unnecessary explanation in here. This person has actually gone into, and this is from a real student's assignment, they've actually gone in and started talking about what the things that they need to do to research the actual budget. They're going to be looking at observations and assumptions. Don't need to talk about that in your introduction paragraph at all, because you're going to have a separate subheading for observations and assumptions, and you'll talk about them there. Also, you'll notice that when you read this paragraph, it's kind of hard to actually work out what the assignment's really about. Looking at this, it looks like someone's doing some sort of a house design. It's actually a a garden renovation that's taking place in this assignment. You can see that in the first sentence that they're looking at a proposal for a television series called Front Yard Fiasco. And in this particular one, they've then started talking about the house design. And these two things aren't connected at all. The whole assignment was about coming up with a backyard renovation. And you can't tell that from reading this opening paragraph. So that makes this not very coherent, which affects your communication grade as well. Okay, now let's move on from our introduction paragraph and talk about what a definition of a variable is. I notice a lot of students, even though I talk about this in the classroom, they often forget to define their variables in their assignment and any key terms as part of their introduction. And so that's a key thing that actually makes them lose marks, either probably on communication or possibly even on the solve part of their assignment. You'll notice this video, it is about Formulate, but there's a lot of crossover between the other parts of your assignment as well in these introductory pages, so that's why it's really important to nail them. So firstly, if you're wanting to define some variables, it's a good idea to use a subheading. And then you need to think about what variables are. They're elements that change. Now, if you're using a formula, for example, a formula like the radius of a circle formula, so we're looking at maybe trying to find the circumference of a circle. Circumference equals 2 times pi times r. The only variables that are there are the radius and the circumference. So if these were critical variables for your assignment, you'd be defining those. How are you going to measure them? Are they going to be measured in centimeters? Are they going to be measured in meters, and so on? If you're looking at bivariate data or graphing anything, variables are what goes on your x-axis and what goes on your y-axis. So, for example, if you're doing year 12, you're going to call that your explanatory and your response variable. And the other grades are going to talk about the independent variable, which is on the x-axis, and the dependent variable that's on the y-axis. So it's really important that in this part of your assignment, if you're going to be graphing anything, you talk about what's the independent variable and what's the dependent variable. And it's also a good idea to explain why you chose one to be independent and the other to be dependent. Sometimes there's situations, such as with bivariate data. For example, if like with that introductory paragraph, let's say you were comparing a femur length to a person's height. One wouldn't necessarily cause the other, so you wouldn't necessarily have one jump out at you and say, this belongs on the x-axis. So you would explain that one doesn't necessarily cause the other. They may have a relationship, however. So you've chosen one to be on the x-axis and one to be on the y-axis. Why did you choose those? It's also a good idea to state how they're going to be measured. So if you're going to be graphing something on the x-axis, that'll be measured in centimeters or meters and so on. So here's an example of how one of my students has defined their variables. I really like this. They've kept it very simple. They've used dot points. It doesn't go on for pages and pages. It doesn't need to. It just needs to be fairly brief. What they've done, it's very clear which particular variable a student has decided is the independent variable and which one they've decided is the dependent variable. Notice they didn't need to actually define what height was or what foot length was or what arm length was. Although, if this is part of your procedure and you're measuring from one place to another, it's also somewhere in here where you could define how that was actually measured. This person has also given their units of measurement, which is really important. That's a clear definition of the variables there. And also they've given their reason for why they've decided that height will go on the y-axis, and that's because it's being compared to a variety of variables. So they've decided to keep that consistent and put that on the y-axis. Now, actually giving that reason right there is a decision that students made, and they've now justified that, and that will also help go towards your evaluation grade when you're justifying your decisions. So that's something to bear in mind too. Like I said before, there is this crossover between your introduction. It sort of flows onto the communication of your whole assignment. It can flow onto the decisions that you're making throughout your assignment and to some of your solve grade as well. Okay, now if you've got any key terms in your assignment, they should also be explained briefly, especially where there might be different interpretations of different variables or different terms that are in the assignment. This could be part of your initial introduction. I've seen it done that way quite well by students. I've also seen students have a separate subheading where they've got the words key terms and they've given their little definitions in there. The definition also provides some justification to some of the decisions you may have made, or it may be part of the reason why you've decided to prepare your sample in a certain way. We'll talk about that in a moment. But you don't need to write a whole textbook. I have seen some students where when they're defining their key terms, they've actually lifted whole sections out of textbooks and it goes on for pages and pages. And this is not necessary. For example, I recently saw an assignment on bivariate data and somebody spent almost a page defining Pearson's correlation coefficient, what it was, how it was used, and it was unnecessary ramble. It didn't really enhance the assignment at all. In fact, it actually detracted from their communication grade because it was no longer concise. That's important to remember. This needs to be a concise section. It's only a small part of the assignment. So here's an example where someone has actually included some of their definitions in the introduction. So they've defined key terms like celebrities and digital characters. This was an assignment where students had to take celebrities' features and compare them by measuring different parts of their face and compare that to digital characters and decide if there was a relationship between the two. Now, it's important when you've got something that's fairly open-ended. What is a celebrity? Does that include only models and actors? Does it include sports people and politicians? So this person has created a definition using the Cambridge Dictionary, and they've said that they are well-known famous people. So they've kept it fairly broad. Digital characters, they've also decided that they are well-known characters from anime or video games. So they've kept that one more narrow because digital characters are often used in film and television as well. So this is a great place. They've done that as part of the introduction. That's a logical place to do it. They've also used a source, and sometimes that really supports your answers and can add weight to your communication as well. This person, however, is a different student. They've decided to define their key terms under a separate subheading. And so they're actually talking about how the foot length and the arm length are measured. And that's also a great way for somebody, if they're actually going to be repeating your procedure, that they could actually take your key term definitions and follow your procedure in the same way. They've also defined gender as well. Okay, so now let's look, speaking of procedures, at a clear and concise procedure. This is also an important part of your introduction. So this could be provided as dot points or numbered steps, and I actually find that it reads a lot better if it is. And it should also be succinct. Now, some people, in the interest of being succinct, they leave steps out or they become quite vague and try and cover multiple steps with a very short sentence. And then they end up losing marks for their Formulate grade, because one of the dot points on your Formulate grade is accurate translation of all aspects of the task. So you want to be making sure that when you are writing your procedure, that all aspects of the task are included. It should be precise and not vague. So if you're going to be drawing a scatter plot, be precise. Are you drawing it by hand or are you drawing it with technology? If you're going to be measuring something, are you going to be measuring that using a calculator or measuring that using your own mathematical techniques? So be precise about how things are happening in your assignment. And the idea of this procedure, if you think of it like cooking a recipe for baking a cake or doing a science experiment, someone else should be able to lift that procedure and follow all the steps you've done and then repeat what you've done as part of their own investigation. Now, obviously, that's never going to happen in real life because we don't plagiarize other people's assignments. But the idea is that someone else was going to take your assignment and go and do the same investigation on the same area. They should be able to do it just from reading the procedure alone. So here's an example of a really good procedure. You'll notice that there are a lot of steps. They've left nothing out, but these steps are only like one line at the most. So they don't go on and on and on for pages. It's succinct. The steps are numbered, so it's very clear what happens first and what happens next. You'll notice it's precise, so they've told us that they hand drew the line of best fit onto the scatter plot, that it was created by technology. You'll also notice it's very comprehensive. All of the steps to complete the assignment are actually included. So it's not just the steps to do the solve part. You'll notice in step 11, they've also mentioned that they're going to be evaluating strengths and limitations. So that's really important as well, that we cover all of the things that we're going to be doing in the PSMT in the procedure. Okay, considerations is one that a lot of people think, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do under this subheading. And they often use the QCAA's website and look at examples of what they've done on their website, on their exemplar assignments, and just try and copy what's under there. Those QCAA examples, by the way, fantastic reference resource to go and have a look at to see how to set your assignment out, what sort of subheadings should you use. But under the considerations heading, there could be a few different things that might go here, and it might not be relevant for every PSMT, depending on what your year level is and what kind of maths you're doing. So you don't always have to have the consideration subheading. It just depends on the kind of assignment you're doing. Now, if you're going to be using data and getting some samples out of that data. So for example, your teacher might provide you with 100 pieces of data and you're told to go and take an appropriate sample from that data set to do your research. So you might want to put some information about how you developed your sample under the considerations heading. For example, if you've decided to choose a sample size of 30 out of the 100 data points, you should talk about under the considerations heading why you chose 30. That's important. It's not just enough to say the sample is going to be 30. You need to explain why 30 is the right number. And you could actually use some research off the internet to support why you chose 30. Now, the reason why the why is important is because later on in your assignment, when you need to evaluate, there's a dot point on your ISMG, which is your instrument specific marking guide, and it says justification of decisions using mathematical reasoning. Now, that gives us the top mark for evaluate if we can hit all of the points on that particular part of our assignment. So it's really important that you explain here what your sample size is and why you chose that sample size. A lot of people also neglect to talk about what method they use. There's lots of different kinds of methods. There's methods where you can actually use a random number generator off the internet to decide which numbers in the data set you'll choose. There's different kinds of sampling where you choose, say, every fifth value, and there's other ones where people may sort it from smallest to largest and then apply another random number generator to it. So explain what method you've chosen and why you chose that method. This is something people often leave out, and they don't get full marks for accurate translation of the procedure because they've left out a key step. There could also be some other important information you could put under considerations. Typically with PSMTs, particularly in senior classes, people are given unique information. So for example, if you were doing a backyard renovation, you might be given a unique block of land size. This is the place where you would state my unique block size, or obviously you're not going to use the word my because we're writing in third person. The unique block size provided was 600 square meters. Or for example, you might have been given a unique budget to source a car. So you might say the budget provided was $20,000. So this is where you give that unique information. I often find students leave that out, even though every student in the whole cohort has a different value that they're given to keep their assignments different, and they forget to tell the teacher in their assignment which value that they were assigned. That's quite important because it really does impact your results. So here's an example. This is taken from the QCAA General Maths exemplar from their website. And there's some really good things that are part of the considerations here. You notice again, it's only brief, doesn't go on for pages and pages. So they tell us firstly what sample size they use. They've used a sample size of 100. Why did they use that? They used that because they found that the square root of 213 was a particular method that they were using, and they decided it was approximately 15, and then they decided to round up and so on. That justified reason is part of your evaluate grade. Here's another example of a student and how they have used considerations. And you'll notice on here that they've talked about what method of sampling that they use. They use systematic sampling, and they've given a reason why. So it's not just enough to say, I use systematic sampling, but it's important that they explain why they actually chose that particular method. So this is a great considerations paragraph. You'll also notice on this one, somebody's talked about their unique block size. So they didn't have to do any sampling at all for this particular type of assignment, but they did have some unique information that was specified just for them. They had a unique block size and they were provided a suburb to do a renovation in, Daisy Hill. So you'll notice that this unique information to their assignment could be put under a consideration subheading, but personally, if that's all you're going to be putting under considerations, I would actually include that in my introduction paragraph instead. Considerations, really, if you're going to have a subheading for one sentence, not really worth it. So put it in the introduction instead. Let's talk about use of technology. Now, elsewhere in your assignment, you are going to use technology to do something. Obviously, you're going to be using Microsoft Word or Pages if you're using Apple technology to develop the writing of the assignment itself, but you're going to do some sort of work potentially on a spreadsheet or using a graphics calculator or using a scientific calculator or some other sort of online calculator. So you need to talk about that as part of your introduction. Very briefly, once again, just a paragraph that explains what technology you've used. Now, once again, this could be under a subheading of its own. And once people put subheadings in, they're kind of tempted to then write lots and lots and lots. You don't really need to. It could just be brief. Microsoft Excel was used for this purpose, and Microsoft Word was used for this purpose. A graphics calculator, Casio, blah, 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 was used for this purpose. And if there's not a lot to say, you could actually put that within your procedure or within your introductory paragraph. So there's flexibility about where you put this information, but it's just really important that you put it in. Otherwise, you won't get the full marks for Formulate. You need to briefly explain what the technology was and what purpose you used it for. So here's an example. This is part of the QCAA's Math Methods exemplar on their website. You'll notice they've stated what technology was used, Excel and Desmos. Notice here it tells us what they used it for, that they're using it for transformation, simultaneous equation solving, and developing models. So state your technology, what its purpose is. This was done as part of the introduction paragraph. This one was actually done under a subheading on the General Maths exemplar on their website. They've stated here what the purpose of it was. Okay, now let's talk very briefly about observations and assumptions. I'm not going to bang on about this one too much because we've got 2 more videos coming up just on that. But you need to actually make sure you've got a minimum of 2 observations and a minimum of 2 assumptions. It's a good idea, I think personally, to have them under subheadings. A subheading that just simply says observations and assumptions. That makes it really clear for your teacher when they're looking for your marks because they want to award you with the top marks. Well, let's have a very quick chat about what is coming up next on the channel. In our next video, you're going to find out all about how to get started on that pesky PSMT, how to get it ready and how to get going and how to get motivated. So I'm going to teach you all that you need to know to get started. We're also going to look then at some later parts on observations and assumptions, move on to solving, etc. Well, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining the channel. If you are new here, welcome. Why not subscribe, like, and hit the notifications button? And to our existing and ongoing subscribers, welcome back. Thank you so much for keeping McClutchy Maths going. And if you would like to tell someone about how helpful this was, why not share it in the comments, tell your teacher, share the video with a friend. I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody for making my job so worthwhile. I'd like to say if you've got any questions at all, you can contact me on mcclutchymaths@yahoo.com via email, but you could also direct message on Facebook and Instagram. And if you follow us there, you'll get some great tips and tricks and you'll always know when a new video is coming. Well, thank you so much again for joining me. I hope this has made your PSMT shine. Look forward to seeing you on the upcoming videos. I'm Natalie McClutchy and you've been watching McClutchy Maths. Have a great day.